We're diving into some pretty intense stuff today. The 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre. A lot of you requested this one, and we've got a ton of material to work with. Newspaper articles, firsthand accounts, historical analyses.
It's a really, really significant event.
Yeah, and honestly, even calling it a riot feels kind of misleading, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's actually a really important point to start with.
Yeah.
This wasn't some random outburst of violence. It was a calculated, a planned attack on Black Atlantans.
Yeah.
Designed to really halt their progress.
What the
If you hear this, you in the place to be. Make sure you like and subscribe to Judah TV HD. Music by Mr. Talk of It. We're here to give you good vibes. Make sure to subscribe, the truth we won't hide. Make sure to listen, you got facts you don't want to be missing. Yeah. If you hear this, you in the place to be. Make sure you like and subscribe to Judah TV HD.
What?
Exactly, and it's kind of shocking how little known this event is, considering the scale of it. We're talking about the single largest outbreak of racial violence in Georgia's history, yet it's not exactly common knowledge.
Right, and that lack of awareness itself is really telling. Right. Reveals a lot about who controls the narrative, who decides what gets remembered and what gets forgotten.
Okay, so let's set the stage right. Atlanta in 1906. The city's booming. It's attracting workers from all over, leading to a pretty significant population increase. And a big chunk of that growth was within the Black community.
Absolutely. And that growth led to a lot of, competition for jobs, resources. And you start to see this white resentment bubbling up towards successful Black businesses, anxiety about Black political influence. I mean, remember, this is after Reconstruction when Black men had the right to vote. So you've got this really volatile situation brewing.
And speaking of successful Black businesses, one of the sources mentions this guy, Alonzo Herndon. He was a Black millionaire, owned a barbershop, and get this, prominent white men were his clients.
Yeah, Herndon's story is really fascinating. Here's this incredibly successful Black entrepreneur operating within a system that's actively trying to hold him back. It's this contradiction that shows just how deeply ingrained prejudice was, even among those who seemingly defied it.
And of course, this is all happening under Jim Crow laws, right?
Yeah.
Which segregated neighborhoods, transportation, pretty much every aspect of public life.
Right. Jim Crow wasn't just a set of laws, It was a way of life. It was a system designed to enforce racial hierarchy. And it created this constant undercurrent of tension that could erupt at any moment.
And the sources point to the 1906 gubernatorial election as a major contributing factor. We've got Hoke Smith and Clark Howell both playing on racial fears to get votes.
Yeah, it's a familiar tactic, isn't it? I mean, you see this throughout history, this political opportunism, using fear and division as a way to gain power.
Yeah.
Smith was much more overt. He campaigned on disenfranchising Black voters. But even Howell, who, presented himself as more moderate, still aimed to appeal to white anxieties about Black political power.
Yeah, it's like a playbook that's been used over and over again.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting here is that both of these guys own newspapers, right? The Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution.
Right. And they use these newspapers as weapons. They publish these sensationalized stories about Black criminality, including completely fabricated accounts of Black men assaulting white women. This wasn't just, a few isolated incidents. It was a deliberate campaign to demonize an entire community.
Yeah, and the sources actually provide specific examples, like articles attacking Black-owned saloons and bars claiming that they were displaying nude pictures of women. I mean, how blatant can you get?
It's classic propaganda appealing to, existing prejudices and fears. It's designed to dehumanize, to create this other, and ultimately to justify violence.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly effective. And unfortunately, we see similar tactics being used even today.
So we have this really volatile mix, simmering tensions, amplified by this divisive election, and then fueled by this really inflammatory media coverage. And then comes September 22nd, 1906, the spark that ignites the massacre.
The newspapers report 4 alleged sexual assaults on white women by Black men, and this is what really sets the mob in motion. One particularly horrifying account describes the attack on Ethel Lawrence and her niece Mabel. They were picking wildflowers. It was brutal.
And it's important to point out that these alleged assaults were never proven, and many historians believe they were fabricated or at least wildly exaggerated to incite violence.
Yeah, that lack of evidence is crucial. These stories, whether they were entirely made up or twisted versions of real events, they served as the catalyst for the violence that followed.
And the reaction was swift and brutal. White mobs formed, targeting Black people indiscriminately. The violence just spread like wildfire from the 5 Points area throughout downtown.
And what's really chilling is how organized this mob actually was. They weren't just lashing out randomly the targets, that the Black businesses, the individuals, the institutions. It all points to a very deliberate effort to crush any sign of Black progress and instill terror in the entire community.
The sources paint this really terrifying picture of the violence. Black people were beaten, stabbed, shot, pulled off streetcars, homes, and businesses looted, destroyed.
It was a reign of terror, calculated and designed to break the spirit of the Black community. I mean, imagine living through that, the constant fear, the knowledge that your life could be taken at any moment simply because of the color of your skin.
One of the sources tells the story of William Welch, a Black barber. He was shot and left to die. Frank Smith, a Black messenger, stabbed and thrown off a bridge. Leola Maddox fatally stabbed while shopping with her husband.
And each of these stories represents countless others that were never recorded, lost to history. It's crucial to remember that these weren't just statistics. These were real people with families, dreams, aspirations. The ripple effects of this violence continue to be felt generations later.
The mob violence was deliberately unpredictable and brutal. It was meant to instill fear not just in specific individuals, but in the entire Black community.
Yeah, this unpredictability is a key element of what we now call terrorism, using violence and fear to achieve political goals. And that's exactly what was happening here. The goal was to suppress Black political and economic power, and they used terror as their weapon.
And as the violence spread, a pivotal confrontation occurred in the Brownsville community. Black residents fearing for their lives, they met to discuss self-defense.
This is a crucial moment of resistance. Faced with this existential threat, the community recognized the need to protect themselves, to take a stand against this onslaught of violence.
But the police, fearing a so-called counterattack, they raided Brownsville, escalating the situation into this shootout between armed Black residents and a mob of white men and police officers.
This event highlights the deep injustice of the system. Black people were systematically disarmed under Jim Crow laws, denied the right to protect themselves. Yet when they did attempt to defend their lives, they were met with overwhelming force by the very people who were supposed to protect them.
And the sources highlight the tragic fates of some key figures in Brownsville. We have Sam Magruder, shot and killed while trying to flee Frank Famro, a respected grocer who had even spoken out against lynching, lynched in his own store. The irony is just...
It's a gut punch.
Yeah.
Famro's story encapsulates the absurdity and the cruelty of the situation. A man who advocates against racial violence becomes a victim of that very violence simply because of the color of his skin. And then you have George Wilder, 70-year-old Civil War veteran, lynched by the mob-age respectability. None of it offered protection from this unbridled hatred.
It's just a devastating reminder of how prejudice dehumanizes people, how it strips away their individuality, their very right to exist in the eyes of those consumed by hate.
And what's perhaps even more disturbing is the role that law enforcement played in all of this. Instead of protecting Black residents, they often escalated the violence.
The sources provide several examples: the police witnessing the attack on Milton Brown but doing nothing to intervene, Black residents being arrested for defending themselves while white mob members go unpunished.
It's a blatant double standard. A clear demonstration that the system was rigged against Black Atlantans. They were denied justice, denied protection, denied even the basic right to safety.
And then you have the officers who killed Will Moreland and James Fletcher under dubious circumstances.
These actions demonstrate how deeply ingrained racial bias was within law enforcement institutions. This wasn't just about a few bad apples. This was a systemic issue, a reflection of the broader societal belief that Black lives were less valuable, less deserving of protection.
The consequences of this massacre were devastating and far-reaching.
Absolutely. We're talking about the further disenfranchisement of Black voters, the expansion of Jim Crow laws, a crippling blow to the Black community and economy, the effects of which are still felt today.
It's like this meticulously planned attack disguised as a riot was just the beginning for me. The aftermath was even more insidious as it reshaped the political and economic landscape to further disadvantage Black Atlantans.
And to add insult to injury, the event was largely ignored or downplayed in official histories. Textbooks barely mentioned it. Monuments didn't acknowledge it. and the stories of the victims were silenced.
It's like a collective amnesia, a deliberate forgetting that allowed those in power to avoid accountability and perpetuate the systems that enabled the violence in the first place.
And that erasure of history is a powerful tool for maintaining the status quo. By silencing these stories, the dominant narrative remains unchallenged, and the roots of racial inequality remain hidden.
Thankfully, that silence has been broken in recent years. There's a growing movement to uncover and acknowledge this history thanks to the work of historians, activists, and community members.
Memorials have been erected, research is being done, and most importantly, the stories of the victims are finally being heard. It's a long overdue reckoning, but it's a crucial step in the process of healing and reconciliation.
But this raises an important question. How does remembering this horrific event help us understand the present? What are the connections between the racial dynamics of 1906 and the challenges we still face today?
That's the key question, isn't it? And that's what we'll explore as we continue our deep dive.
Stay tuned. So we've uncovered this just horrific event, the 1906 Atlanta race massacre. But it's clear that this wasn't just some, 4-day outburst. The impact of this thing has stretched across generations.
Yeah, and one of the most immediate and devastating consequences was the further disenfranchisement of Black voters. Think about it. The massacre itself was used as justification for stricter Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, all these tools designed to suppress Black political power.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they incite this violence and then use that violence as an excuse for even more oppression.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a cycle that we see throughout history. Take, for example, the aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921.
Mm-hmm.
There, too, the destruction of Black Wall Street and the ensuing violence were used to justify further segregation and disenfranchisement. It's about, manipulating fear and power to solidify control.
And that disenfranchisement, it had this long-lasting impact. It's not just about voting. It's about having a voice, and shaping your own destiny.
Exactly. It limited Black Atlantans' ability to advocate for their rights, to access resources, to have a say in the decisions that impacted their lives. And, when you silence a community's voice, you perpetuate the very inequalities that led to the violence in the first place.
The sources also talk about the economic devastation, inflicted on the Black community. We mentioned Alonzo Herndon's barbershop being targeted. Was this like a widespread phenomenon?
Oh, absolutely. Black-owned businesses were systematically destroyed and looted during the massacre. Mm-hmm. And what's often overlooked is that many of these businesses were thriving, serving both Black and white customers. They were symbols of Black economic success, and that, in the eyes of the mob, made them targets.
So it's like a deliberate attempt to undermine Black economic power, a tactic that's sadly been repeated throughout history.
Right, think about redlining, for example. That practice, which emerged in the decades after the massacre, systematically denied Black families access to loans and housing in desirable neighborhoods. And that has a direct link to the wealth gap that we see today. It's about denying opportunities, about keeping certain communities trapped in cycles of poverty.
The sources also highlight the role of memory and historical narratives. It seems like there was a real concerted effort to minimize or even erase this event from the city's history.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It wasn't just about forgetting, it was a deliberate silencing. For decades, the 1906 Atlanta race massacre was downplayed in official accounts. Textbooks barely mention it. Monuments didn't acknowledge it. It's like they tried to pretend it never happened.
It's like a form of historical gaslighting, making an entire community question their own memories and experiences.
Exactly. And this silence allowed the dominant narrative to persist, the narrative that downplayed the role of racism and upheld systems of power and privilege. But what's remarkable is that despite this concerted effort to erase it, the memory of the massacre persisted within the Black community. It was passed down through oral histories, family stories, and a deep-seated understanding of the city's true past.
It's almost like a counter-narrative, a hidden history that challenged the official version.
Exactly, and thankfully in recent years, that counter-narrative has started to break through. Historians, activists, and community members have worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, to bring this buried history to light. It's like excavating a hidden treasure, a piece of the past that was deliberately concealed.
And with that excavation comes a sense of validation, of finally having your story acknowledged and believed.
Precisely. It's a powerful act of reclaiming history, of challenging the narratives that have been used to silence and marginalize certain communities.
Yeah.
And it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to let the truth be buried.
So we've established that this event has cast this long shadow impacting voting rights, economic opportunities, even the way history is told. But how do we bridge the gap between 1906 and the present? What are the parallels between the racial dynamics of that era and the challenges we face today?
That's where things get really thought-provoking. What's important to understand is that the 1906 Atlanta race massacre wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger and ongoing story about racial violence and systemic oppression in this country.
So you're saying there are these threads connecting this historical event to issues we grapple with today, like police brutality, mass incarceration, voter suppression, economic inequality.
Absolutely. These are not separate issues. They're interconnected.
Yeah.
The forms of oppression may have shifted over time, but the underlying systems of power and privilege remain remarkably similar.
It's like those newspapers we discussed earlier, the ones that demonized Black men and stoked racial fears. That same tactic, that same manipulation of fear for political gain. It echoes in certain media outlets and political rhetoric, even today.
The language might be more coded. The dog whistle's a little subtler. But the intent is the same, to create divisions, to justify inequality, and to maintain a hierarchy based on race. It's about exploiting anxieties, tapping into those deep-seated prejudices that have been woven into the fabric of our society.
And the complicity of law enforcement in the violence back then, that really resonates with the calls for police reform and accountability that we see today.
Yeah, the systemic racism embedded within law enforcement institutions is a direct legacy of our history. Think about the militarization of police forces, the over-policing of Black communities, the lack of accountability when officers use excessive force. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a deeper problem, a problem that is rooted in our history.
So if this massacre is a piece of a larger ongoing story, what can we learn from it to help us navigate the challenges of today?
First and foremost, we must acknowledge the truth of our history no matter how uncomfortable it may be. We can't move forward as a society without confronting the legacies of racial violence and oppression that continue to shape our world.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But it's more than just remembering. It's about understanding the impact, the ripple effects that continue to shape our present.
Exactly. Second, we must challenge the narratives that perpetuate racial stereotypes and divisions. This means being critical consumers of media, questioning assumptions, and amplifying the voices of those who are marginalized and misrepresented.
It's about being aware of those subtle biases, the implicit assumptions that we might not even realize we hold.
Right, and it also means actively seeking out diverse perspectives, listening to lived experiences, and challenging the stories that uphold systems of power and privilege.
And of course, supporting organizations and individuals working to dismantle systemic racism.
That's crucial. Putting our money, our time, and our energy behind the organizations and individuals who are on the ground fighting for change, advocating for policies that promote equity and justice. It's about being active participants in creating a more just world, not passive observers.
So it's a multi-pronged approach: education, challenging narratives, active support. It sounds like a lot, but where do we even begin? What are some tangible steps we can take to honor the memory of those who suffered during the 1906 Atlanta race massacre and work towards a more just future?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what we'll delve into as we wrap up our deep dive.
It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed, by all this, all this tragedy, this history, and the fact that these issues are still so present today. But amidst all that, amidst the horror of the 1906 Atlanta race massacre, is there anything hopeful we can take away from all this?
There is. Remember the Brownsville community we talked about?
Mm-hmm.
The residents who armed themselves to protect their homes, their families?
Yeah.
That's a powerful testament to resilience, to that unwavering spirit in the face of unimaginable oppression.
Yeah, it's like this phoenix rising from the ashes. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there's this fierce will to survive, to fight for something better.
Exactly. And that spirit of resistance has echoed throughout history. It fueled the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. Countless individuals who've dedicated their lives to fighting for equality and justice. It's a legacy of courage that we can and should draw strength from.
So learning about this massacre isn't just about looking back, it's about finding inspiration from those who resisted, those who refused to be silenced or broken.
Precisely. Their stories offer us a roadmap, for how we can engage in this fight for racial justice today. They show us that even small acts of resistance, speaking out, refusing to be complicit, can have this ripple effect.
I keep thinking about Alonzo Herndon, the Black millionaire whose barbershop was destroyed. Did he just give up after that? I mean, it just seems like such a devastating loss, both personally and symbolically.
Not at all. Herndon was an extraordinary individual. He rebuilt his business and went on to found the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, one of the most successful Black-owned businesses in the country. He turned tragedy into triumph.
Wow, that's incredible. He really embodied that spirit of resilience we were just talking about. He refused to let hate win.
Yeah, Herndon's story is a powerful reminder that progress is possible. Even in the face of these immense obstacles, we can choose hope, we can choose action, we can choose to build a better future.
So what are some concrete steps, that we can take to honor the memory of those who suffered during the massacre and work towards that more just future? What does turning knowledge into action actually look like?
Well, first, let's commit to educating ourselves and others about this history. Read books, articles, watch documentaries, visit museums, have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations about race and racism. Knowledge is power.
It's like that saying, right? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we bring these hidden histories to light, the more we understand the roots of injustice, the better equipped we are to dismantle it.
Exactly. And it's not just about learning the facts, It's about connecting with the humanity of the victims, understanding the ripple effects of this violence, and seeing how it connects to the present.
So education's key. What else?
Second, we have to support the organizations that are on the ground working to dismantle systemic racism. Donate to groups fighting for criminal justice reform, advocating for equitable housing and education, promoting economic empowerment in marginalized communities.
It's about putting our money where our mouth is, right? Supporting those organizations and individuals who are doing the day-to-day work of creating a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. Third, let's be intentional about amplifying the voices of those who are often silenced or marginalized,
Yeah.
Seek out diverse perspectives, listen to lived experiences, challenge the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes and prejudice.
It's about being allies, using our platforms and privilege to create space for those who are too often ignored or dismissed. It's about actively listening and learning from those who have experienced injustice firsthand.
And finally, we have to hold ourselves and those around us accountable for our words and actions. Challenge racist jokes, speak up against discrimination, create environments where everyone feels safe and respected.
It's about practicing anti-racism in our everyday lives. It's about recognizing that dismantling racism is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, even in seemingly small ways.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we are all part of this story and we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable future.
At the beginning of this deep dive, it felt so heavy, almost overwhelming. But ending on this note of action, of hope, it feels empowering. It feels like something we can actually do.
That's the key. Turning knowledge into action, despair into hope. The 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre is a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty. But it's also a testament to the enduring spirit of those who fought for a better world. And we can honor their memory by continuing that fight together.
Beautifully said. And to all of you listening out there, remember this conversation doesn't end here.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for justice.
Because the work is never done. The fight for equality is a marathon, not a sprint, and we have to keep running towards that horizon of justice together.
This was our first artificial intelligence-assisted video. We hope you enjoy and are patient as we get better and better. Make sure to subscribe to see our new educational videos, coming soon. For educational books on these topics and more, visit us at staywokebookstore.com.